Can you believe that the greatest, most catastrophic war of the ancient world, a decade-long siege that saw demigods clash, cities burn, and entire royal bloodlines erased from history, didn't begin with politics or oil or land, but with a petty, childish squabble between three immortal, impossibly beautiful women? This is the truth that history books dare not whisper loud enough. Troy fell, Greece bled, and the Aegean Sea ran crimson because of a single, shiny golden apple thrown into a wedding party by the goddess of discord herself. A catastrophe no one saw coming, yet one that was absolutely guaranteed by the fatal flaw of the gods, their ego, their jealousy, and their endless need for human affirmation. Imagine the scene. The ultimate ancient power couple, the mortal king Peleus and the shimmering sea nymph Thetis, are getting married. Every god, every hero, every mythical creature is invited to the grandest party Olympus has ever thrown, except for one. Eris, the spurned deity of chaos, stands outside the gates of the celebration, burning with righteous, divine fury. She knows she cannot fight them, but she also knows exactly how to plant a seed of destruction that will sprout into 1,000 ships and a decade of unimaginable horror. She hurls a single piece of fruit, gleaming and perfect, inscribed with two simple, devastating words, "For the fairest." And instantly, the music stops, the laughter dies, the feast is forgotten. Every single goddess present wants that apple, but three step forward with a terrible, possessive magnetism that chills the blood of the assembled heroes. Hera, the mighty queen of heaven, wielding ultimate political power and thunder. Athena, the warrior of wisdom, brilliant and terrifying in her cold, strategic brilliance. And Aphrodite, the goddess of love and absolute impossible beauty. They cannot agree. The fight is too great. Even Zeus, the mighty king of the gods, refuses to referee this divine catfight, knowing that choosing one means incurring the eternal, vengeful hatred of the other two for all eternity. They need a judge, a mortal who can be swayed, corrupted, and ultimately blamed for the ensuing global chaos. They chose a shepherd, a prince exiled from his birthright, a beautiful fool named Paris, sitting innocently on Mount Ida, tending his flocks. This is the precise moment the war truly begins, not in blood, but in promises, and in the ultimate betrayal of innocence. Hera steps forward, her eyes burning with the lust for absolute control, and offers Paris the one thing mortals always crave: power. She offers him dominion over all Asia, the chance to be the mightiest emperor the world has ever known. Athena, cool, calculating, and deadly, promises him invincibility in battle and wisdom beyond any living man. The chance to become a legend of strategy and intellect, a name that would echo forever in the annals of war. And then came Aphrodite, smiling with a terrifying, absolute certainty. She didn't offer thrones or glory. She offered the impossible, the most beautiful woman in the entire cosmos, Helen of Sparta, whose face, though she was already married, would launch those infamous 1,000 ships straight toward ruin. Paris, blinded by mortal desire and adolescent lust, instantly chooses Aphrodite. He chooses lust and devastating beauty over empire and wisdom. In that instant, he sealed the doom of his magnificent golden city and earned the eternal, murderous hatred of both Hera and Athena. This single, self-serving decision sets the cosmic gears grinding. But wait, we need to understand who Helen was and why taking her was not just a crime of passion, but an act of universal political suicide that forced an entire civilization into war. Helen wasn't just Queen of Sparta. She was the political linchpin of the entire Greek world, the very nexus of power and obligation. Years earlier, when Helen was merely a breathtaking princess, every single ambitious hero and prince in Greece, from the towering Ajax to the cunning Odysseus, had traveled to Sparta to win her hand, bringing impossible wealth and endless armies with them. Her stepfather, the aging King Tyndareus, was paralyzed by fear. He knew that whoever he chose, the hundreds of rejected, prideful, sword-wielding suitors would immediately wage war against the victor. It would be a catastrophic civil war before the marriage even took place. It was the famously clever and often treacherous Odysseus of Ithaca who stepped in with a brilliant solution, a legal maneuver that would accidentally doom them all. He proposed the Oath of Tyndareus. He demanded a binding pact, sworn to the very gods, that all the unsuccessful suitors would unite to protect the chosen husband's honor and defend Helen against any man who dared to steal her away, no matter the cost. Tyndareus chose Menelaus, the wealthy and powerful brother of the High King, Agamemnon. The trap was set. When Paris, protected by the scheming Aphrodite, arrived years later in Sparta, ostensibly as a guest, but secretly as a thief, Menelaus was away on business in Crete. The timing was perfect, the betrayal absolute. Paris didn't just steal a woman, he violated the sacred laws of hospitality, he broke the ancient political balance, and most critically, he triggered the most powerful, legally binding, divinely enforced contract in the history of the Greek city-states. When Menelaus returned, the shock turned into blinding, earth-shaking rage. He didn't just lose his wife, he was publicly humiliated, and the entire structure of his power was undermined before the eyes of the world. He immediately called upon his brother Agamemnon, the supreme high king of Mycenae, and together they invoked the Oath of Tyndareus. The fuse was lit, and the deadline was set in stone. The greatest heroes of the age, men who thought they were done with war and settling into their kingdoms, suddenly found themselves enslaved to a 10-year-old promise, forced by divine mandate to sail across the Aegean and burn Troy to the ground. This, my friends, is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with a selfish choice and a forgotten, terrible oath. The call went out, echoing across the hills of Argos and Ithaca, gathering the greatest army the world had ever seen, all because of an apple, a promise, and a face that launched 1,000 ships. The stage is set for a bloodbath, but before the first ship even launches, the gods demand one final, unspeakable sacrifice. The Oath of Tyndareus was not a gentleman's agreement. It was a cosmic leash, snapping taut around the necks of the greatest warriors the world had ever known. When Paris, that thief in the night, finally sailed away with Helen, the most dangerous woman in history, the contractual bloodlust activated instantly, demanding payment in bronze and bone. Kings who had never intended to fight, leaders who held vast empires and prized their comfortable lives, were now legally and spiritually bound to follow the banner of Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae. His brother, Menelaus, was a pathetic figure, but the law of the oath was absolute, turning petty vengeance into a continental mobilization, transforming a marital spat into an existential crisis. The first sign that this was no ordinary skirmish was the sheer difficulty in drafting the superstars. Two men, in particular, knew the secret prophecies whispered by the fates, that this war would be eternal, consuming their best years, perhaps their very lives. The brilliant Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, tried desperately to disqualify himself from the venture. He plowed his fields with salt, harnessing an ox and an ass together, scattering worthless grains to feign the complete madness of a man unsuited for command. He had a young wife and a newborn son, Telemachus, and he wanted no part of the cursed journey. Yet Palamedes, that snake of logic, ripped the mask right off him. Palamedes placed the baby Telemachus directly in front of the plow. Odysseus, a father before he was a hero, swerved instantly, revealing his sanity, sentencing himself to a decade of slaughter and a lifetime of wandering. The strategist was secured, but the Greeks needed the weapon. They needed the inevitable engine of war, Achilles, the half-god, the furious destroyer, whose very name meant both victory and doom. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, knew his terrible destiny, a short, glorious life or a long, unremarkable one, and she had tried desperately to cheat the fates. She had hidden him on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. She dressed the boy god in silk and lace, hoping to contain that savage nature. But Achilles' temper was too wild, his movements too sharp, his destiny too loud to be contained by a mere dress. Odysseus and Diomedes, masters of trickery themselves, arrived bearing gifts, glittering jewelry for the true girls, and a magnificent, shining shield and spear hidden among the trinkets. The true test came when the signal horn sounded, a sudden, shocking war cry that echoed off the cliffs. All the true daughters of Lycomedes screamed and scattered in feminine terror, but the disguised Achilles, with the reflex of the warrior that ran in his divine blood, instantly grabbed the shield and the spear, dropping the mask entirely. The world held its breath. Achilles was found. The Greek coalition was now complete, gathering at the massive harbor of Aulis, a place destined to become the staging ground for global tragedy. The fleet was terrifying, 1,200 ships, manned by 100,000 men, a dark forest of masts and sails waiting for the command that would shake the foundations of Asia Minor. But the gods, always demanding their due, paused the entire colossal endeavor. High King Agamemnon, the man who had called this immense force into being, had committed the ultimate foolish sin of hubris, forgetting his place in the cosmic hierarchy. While hunting in the sacred grove near Aulis, he killed a majestic stag, a creature beloved by the fierce goddess Artemis, the lady of the wild. Worse, in his drunken pride, he dared to boast, shouting to the heavens that even Artemis herself could not have made a cleaner kill, that his arrow was superior to her divine craftsmanship. This blasphemy was heard across Olympus, and the consequence was immediate, crushing, and physical. The winds vanished entirely. The Aulis harbor, usually a churning symphony of sea and salt, became a mere still, stagnant, suffocating lake. The sails hung slack, mocking the desperate warriors, who grew restless and starving. Weeks turned into months. The massive army, unable to move, started devouring its own supplies, breeding pestilence, and turning its fury inward. Mutiny was a heartbeat away. Agamemnon, seeing his authority dissolve into frustration, finally called upon the prophet, Calchas, the man who saw the terrifying future in the glistening entrails of goats. Calchas, pale and shaking with fear of the goddess, delivered the news that shattered the High King's world. Artemis was offended, deeply and mortally, and the sacrifice of 1,000 oxen would not appease her. She demanded a single, human price, a life of unparalleled purity, a life inextricably linked to the boaster himself. The agonizing choice ripped Agamemnon apart. His duty to the massive coalition, his contractual obligation to the oath, the terror of 100,000 men turning on their leader, all weighed against the desperate, fundamental love for his child. He tried to refuse. He secretly ordered the fleet disbanded. But Odysseus and the other warlords, obsessed with the glory and the treasure of Troy, intercepted the orders, forcing the king's hand with cold, rational threat. The decision was made. The war was more important than a single life. They concocted a monstrous, sweet-sounding lie to lure the unsuspecting girl from her mother, Clytemnestra, back in Mycenae, marry the king's radiant daughter before sailing off to glory. Iphigenia, adorned in bridal white, dreaming of eternal bliss beside the glorious Achilles, sailed happily to Aulis, unknowingly sailing toward her own execution. Clytemnestra, already protective and deeply suspicious of her husband's ambitions, accompanied her. Iphigenia, facing the horrifying realization, submitted to the will of the gods and the terrible needs of the army, walking willingly to her fate. The wind remained stubbornly silent, waiting for the ultimate payment of innocence. The Aegean Sea had never witnessed such a terrifying sight. 1,000 ships, their sails bloated with the blood-bought wind, stretched from horizon to horizon, a moving continent of bronze and vengeance. Every great king, every legendary warrior from the known world was crammed onto those decks, their faces grim, haunted by the price they had just paid in Aulis. This was not a vacation cruise. It was a floating prison of obligation. They were sailing straight into the jaws of destiny, and everyone knew the horrifying prophecy that shadowed their arrival. The oracle had been brutally clear. The first Achaean to step foot upon the sacred sands of Troy would instantly claim the glorious, yet catastrophic, prize of death. For days, the vast armada surged across the wine-dark sea, a terrifying shadow moving toward the Anatolian coast. They saw the looming silhouette of Mount Ida and the legendary walls of Troy, impenetrable, defiant, massive monuments to King Priam's wealth and divine favor. These were walls built by Poseidon himself, and they seemed to mock the mortal efforts of the approaching fleet. When the first ships scraped against the beach near the mouth of the Scamander River, a paralyzing silence fell. Thousands of men gripped their spears, sweating in their bronze armor, staring at the hostile shoreline. No one moved. The prophecy held them captive, freezing the greatest army ever assembled into a terrified, hesitant mob, unable to execute the very invasion they had sailed years to achieve. Then, one man broke the spell of fear. Protesilaus, the brave chieftain from Phylace, knew the cost but chose the eternal weight of glory over the momentary shame of cowardice. He didn't hesitate. His personal ambition, or perhaps sheer desperation, drove him forward. He vaulted over the railing of his ship, throwing caution and his very life to the violent gods. His feet struck the golden sand, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking moment, he was the only man to have successfully claimed Trojan land. The silence of the beach was suddenly charged with tragic significance. But fate is swift and merciless. Almost before the spray of the Aegean had dried on his boots, a figure emerged from the high dunes, a lethal shadow named Hector, the greatest warrior Troy possessed. Hector, the shining prince, the city's defensive shield, saw the insolence of the lone invader and moved with devastating speed. One massive swing of his bronze spear, delivered with the righteous fury of a man defending his home, and Protelaus crumpled, the first blood spilled, the prophecy chillingly fulfilled. The Trojan War had officially found its first victim, a martyr whose sacrifice instantly ignited the cold fury of the waiting Greeks. The death of Protelaus was the spark that shattered the stalemate. Agamemnon, screaming orders from the flagship, unleashed the fury of the entire coalition. The ramps crashed down, and the Achaean horde surged ashore, a tsunami of bronze shields and hacking swords that swept away any remaining hesitation. The fighting was immediate, brutal, and chaotic, turning the pristine beach into a red slaughterhouse within minutes. The air was thick with the dust of battle and the screams of the dying, as the sheer overwhelming mass of the Greek forces pushed back the initial desperate Trojan defense. While the main army fought to establish a secure perimeter, the logistical genius of the Greeks came into horrifying focus. They dragged the immense black ships onto the sand, forming a massive defensive wall, a vital barrier against counterattack in the elements. They began building the sprawling temporary city that would be their home for the next decade, a logistical feat almost as daunting as the war itself. And among the chaos, moving like a demigod among mere mortals, was Achilles, the son of the sea nymph Thetis. The man whose rage was legendary, the centerpiece of the entire Greek effort, moved through the ranks of the bewildered Trojan skirmishers. He was unstoppable, a whirlwind of death, clearing the beachhead almost single-handedly, a terrifying force of nature, ensuring that no Trojan could interfere with the establishment of the permanent camp. His very presence was a weapon, crushing the morale of the defenders who witnessed his impossible speed and strength. But the early victories were grossly misleading. Troy was not some minor coastal city. Its walls were rumored to be built by the gods themselves, a defiant fortress that laughed at siege engines. The Greeks quickly realized that a direct assault was suicide, a guaranteed way to exhaust their massive army against stone and divine protection. They were stuck. The promised quick victory turned into an immediate, grinding deadlock, a terrifying realization for men who had left their kingdoms and families behind for a glorious 6-month campaign. Troy held, and the siege began in earnest, immediately devolving into frustration. 10 years, that was the sentence they unknowingly faced. And for the first 3 years, the war was less about conquering Troy and more about surviving the weight and maintaining cohesion. The Greeks, needing supplies, food, and maintaining the morale of hundreds of thousands of idle men, began to raid the surrounding territories. This was the dark, necessary heart of the stalled war. The supply raids that sustained the army but expanded the conflict far beyond the walls of Troy. They pillaged towns loyal to Priam, securing food, gold, and slaves, but also expanding the network of their bitter, vengeful enemies across the Troad. These were the years when the great heroes built their personal legends through peripheral massacres and brutal treasure hunts. Odysseus, the wily king, focused on intelligence and supply lines, while Achilles became the undisputed master of the raid, sacking city after city, including the crucial town of Lyrnessus, capturing the beautiful Briseis. But even while fighting the Trojans, the Greeks were already tearing themselves apart. Inside the cramped, disease-ridden camp, internal politics were more dangerous than Hector's spear. The greatest casualty of this early phase wasn't a Trojan soldier, but the brilliant Greek strategist, Palamedes. Palamedes was too clever, too moral, and too much of a threat to the established power structure. He had been instrumental in exposing Odysseus's attempted draft dodge before the war started, forcing the king of Ithaca onto the battlefield, and Odysseus never forgot the humiliation. Odysseus decided that Palamedes had to disappear, eliminating a rival who consistently outsmarted him at strategy and diplomacy. The plot he hatched was one of pure, calculated evil, a masterpiece of dark ingenuity designed to destroy Palamedes' reputation before taking his life. Odysseus forged a letter, allegedly from King Priam, detailing a secret bribe Palamedes had taken to betray the Greek cause and cripple their supply lines. He then meticulously buried a large cache of gold under Palamedes' tent to provide the physical, damning proof of his treason. It was a chilling testament to the moral decay that had already infected the Achaean cause, proving that the gods didn't need to punish the Greeks. They were perfectly capable of destroying their own best men through petty jealousy and political maneuvering. The long, bloody shadow of internal betrayal had just fallen across the Greek camp. The assembly was complete. Every major king, every sworn warrior, every promised ship had finally answered the agonizing, inescapable call of the Oath of Tyndareus. This was no casual gathering of fishing vessels. This was a Leviathan armada, 1,000 black ships darkening the very horizon, carrying men whose names would forever be synonyms for slaughter and glory. The very sight of this fleet gathered at the sheltered harbor of Aulis was an affront to the gods of the sea, a physical representation of the massive, uncontainable hubris of mankind. They were a weapon pointed directly at the heart of Asia Minor, propelled by lust, honor, and the binding contract they could not break. Agamemnon, the High King, stood at the pinnacle of this terrible power, yet his crown already felt like a crown of thorns, knowing that managing these volatile, pride-filled heroes was a war in itself, and that the divine forces were only just beginning to test his resolve. He gave the signal. The sails were unfurled, snapping taut against the rigging, ready to catch the fierce northern winds that traditionally swept through the Aegean Sea, promising swift passage toward the enemy shores. But then the unthinkable happened. The first true, chilling sign that this war was not merely a mortal endeavor, but a pawn game played out in the halls of Olympus. Nothing. Silence fell upon the harbor, a suffocating, heavy silence that pressed the life out of the air. The sails drooped instantly like wet, discarded rags, mocking the warriors' eagerness. The 1,000 ships of Greece were paralyzed, trapped by an invisible, immovable barrier of dead air. The mighty Achaean war machine, forged in fire and bound by unbreakable oaths, was stalled not by an enemy army or a powerful navy, but by a meteorological tantrum that stretched from days into weeks, then months, breeding frustration, illness, and mutiny among the restless troops. This forced stagnation was worse than any physical battle. It fueled the internal whispers and petty rivalries that the generals had just managed to suppress, threatening to tear the coalition apart before it had even tasted Trojan soil. The gods were sending a clear, terrifying message: you will not pass easily. You must pay a terrible toll. Desperate, terrified of losing control of his immense, restless army, Agamemnon summoned Calchas, the prophet, whose sight pierced the veil of divine intentions, demanding to know the price of passage. The air crackled with a terrifying foreboding as Calchas drew back, his eyes wide with a horror that transcended mortal fear and looked straight into the abyss of divine wrath. The goddess Artemis, the fierce mistress of the wild, the silver-bowed huntress, had been grievously and personally offended. The exact reasons were cloaked in typical divine pettiness, yet the consequences were cosmic and absolute. Perhaps Agamemnon had dared to boast he was a better archer than the goddess herself, or perhaps his men had recklessly hunted a sacred stag in her holy grove. Calchas spoke the words that instantaneously shattered the camp's morale and Agamemnon's very soul, words that ensured his name would forever be synonymous with tragic betrayal. The winds will only rise again when you sacrifice your own daughter, the Princess Iphigenia, upon the altar. A paralyzing silence descended upon the gathered kings, the horrific demand hanging in the still air. Menelaus, the injured husband whose lust for revenge started this mess, looked away, unable to meet his brother's tormented eyes. Odysseus, the master strategist and coldest heart present, began immediately calculating the political fallout and the necessary steps to manage the crisis. But for Agamemnon, the High King, the world collapsed into a single, unbearable choice: duty or dynasty, glory for Greece or the life of his beloved child. He was the commander-in-chief of the entire Achaean force, bound by the contract. If he refused, the sacred oath of Tyndarus would be instantly broken. The entire coalition would dissolve, and the vast army, now bored, hungry, and enraged, would likely turn its considerable destructive power inward upon its own leaders and homelands. He knew he could not refuse the demand of the goddess. The weight of the world, the promise of glory, the fear of internal mutiny, and the inescapable demands of the contract compelled him forward, driving him toward the most horrific, soul-crushing act of his entire life. He chose war. He chose destiny. He chose the dagger that would sever his family forever. A message was dispatched immediately to Mycenae, carried by the swiftest runners, addressed to his wife, Clytemnestra. The content was a carefully crafted, glorious lie, dripping with false honor and irresistible promise. It falsely claimed that the greatest of all Greek warriors, the near-immortal Achilles, refused to sail unless he married a woman of the highest royal blood, a daughter of Agamemnon himself. The deceit stated that Iphigenia was needed at Aulis immediately, not for a bloody, agonizing sacrifice, but for a glorious, destiny-binding wedding to the greatest hero the world had ever seen. The bait was irresistible, uniting the powerful house of Atreus with the unbeatable house of Peleus. Clytemnestra, swollen with pride and completely oblivious to the unspeakable horror awaiting her child, rushed her daughter to the port of Aulis, dressed not in the dark robes of death, but in the shimmering white silks of a joyous bride-to-be. The innocent, beautiful princess arrived, escorted by proud guards, ready to meet her glorious groom. The wind, a howling, magnificent beast, finally filled the sails of the Achaean fleet, but it carried no song of triumph. It carried only the silent, echoing scream of a princess betrayed, the final, horrifying price paid to drag 1,000 black ships across the Aegean Sea. Agamemnon, the king of kings, stood on his flagship, his face a mask of stone, knowing that the blood of his daughter had been the only fuel potent enough to launch the greatest military expedition the world had ever known. 30,000 men, a veritable ocean of bronze and fury, were finally in motion, their destiny charted by an oath sworn long ago and sealed by a celestial game of vanity. Every corner of Greece had emptied its heroes onto these waves. The shrewd Nestor, the mighty Ajax, the relentless Odysseus, and towering above them all, the devastating Achilles, a weapon wrapped in human skin and driven by a thirst for immortal glory. The sheer, monstrous noise of the fleet was deafening, 1,000 hulls creaking, oars churning the water to foam, a floating city aimed at a single prosperous target on the Asian coast. But the scale of the operation was so vast, the command structure so fractured, that it introduced its own fatal flaws of logistics and pride before they even met a true enemy. They sailed for days, then weeks, guided not by detailed maps, for the geography of this distant shore was vague even to the most seasoned sailors, but by sheer, blind aggression and the intoxicating promise of vengeance and plunder. In their desperate haste, in their overwhelming desire to make the sacrifice of Iphigenia worthwhile, the Achaeans made a colossal, humiliating mistake, so profound it would cost them nearly a decade before the real siege even began. They did not land at the formidable, well-defended gates of Troy, the city of Priam. Instead, they landed far south, crashing ashore on the unsuspecting coast of Mysia, a kingdom ruled by a powerful man named Telephus, a son of the legendary Heracles. The Achaeans, hot from the sea and fueled by their own internalized guilt and simmering rage, assumed any coastal defense must belong to Priam's vast network of allies. They exploded onto the beaches, a terrifying wave of bronze axes and spears, slaughtering the innocent farmers and burning the fields in a horrific display of misplaced, directionless brutality. Telephus, shocked by the sudden, overwhelming invasion of what seemed like the entire Western world, rushed to defend his land, fighting with the inherited, monumental strength of his divine lineage. He was a formidable warrior, driving back the initial Greek landing parties, inflicting heavy casualties, momentarily stalling the thunderous momentum of the 1,000 ships, and reminding the Greeks that landing was not the same as conquest. It took the brutal, uncompromising intervention of the war's ultimate killing machine, the half-divine Achilles himself, to break the standoff. Achilles, guided by the cruel hand of fate, met Telephus in single combat, and the clash was brief but devastating in its consequences for the entire expedition. Telephus was struck down, his thigh ripped open by a blow from the famous bronze spear of Achilles, a weapon forged by the centaur Chiron and rumored to possess powerful mystical properties. The Mysians scattered, the Greeks claimed a meaningless, confusing victory, and the fleet settled down to regroup, believing they had already taken a minor Trojan satellite outpost. But the victory was hollow. and the cost was not lives, but the infinitely more valuable commodity of time. Telephus's wound was strange. It refused to close, festering, putrefying, and causing him unimaginable, searing pain that no mortal physician could alleviate. Simultaneously, the Achaeans finally, miserably realized their colossal error. They were nowhere near Troy. They had wasted their initial burst of fury, their sacred motivation, on an unrelated, minor kingdom, an expendable pawn in the grand celestial game. Humiliation swept through the ranks, threatening to unravel the entire expedition before the main event could even be announced. The logistical nightmare intensified daily. Supplies began to run desperately low. The men grew restless, the guilt over the death of Iphigenia festering like a silent, spiritual poison in the leadership's hearts. They were forced to retreat back to their ships, defeated not by an enemy army, but by their own ignorance, their own inability to navigate the world they sought to conquer. Telephus, desperate for relief, traveled the known world seeking a cure, only to receive a horrifying, inescapable prophecy from the oracle at Delphi: "The wounder shall be the healer." This meant only Achilles, the man who had maimed him, could save him from a slow, agonizing death. 8 long, agonizing years passed. The mighty Achaean fleet, the terror of the sea, was forced to idle, rusting and stagnating on distant, inhospitable shores, its purpose forgotten, its heroes scattered or demoralized by the sheer pointlessness of their encampment. 8 full years of waiting for a wounded king to swallow his pride and seek help from the very man who destroyed him. This single, accidental detour, the Mysian mistake, proved that fate was not just guiding the Greeks to war, but deliberately torturing them, punishing their hubris, and ensuring their suffering was maximized. When Telephus finally dragged himself, a walking skeleton of pain and desperation, back to the Achaean camp, seeking Achilles' mercy, the warriors who greeted him were not the fresh, eager soldiers who had set sail from Aulis. They were hardened, cynical men, weary of the very existence of war, nearly forgetting why they had sailed in the first place. The expedition was rescued from utter, catastrophic collapse only by this desperate, final plea for aid from their accidental enemy. Achilles, initially baffled and indifferent to healing as he was expert at hurting, was hesitant. It was Odysseus, the master strategist who saw deeper than bronze and blood, who divined the true solution. The wounder was not Achilles' hands, but his weapon, the spear itself. Scrapings of rust and verdigris from the famous bronze spearhead were applied directly to the putrid wound, and instantly, miraculously, Telephus was healed. Grateful and eternally indebted, Telephus gave the Greeks what they truly needed: not gold, not supplies, but the precise, undeniable sailing directions to Troy. The lost Achaean fleet, now scarred by 8 years of pointless wandering and corrosive internal strife, was finally, truly aimed at its legendary target. The first battle had been fought, the first great mistake rectified, but the 9 years of actual siege had not even begun. The journey itself had been a hidden war of attrition, and the gods, sitting on Olympus, were clearly enjoying the prologue immensely. The greatest armada the world had ever conceived finally clawed its way across the wine-dark sea, a terrifying shadow stretching from horizon to horizon. 1,186 ships, crammed with the vengeful fury of the Achaean world, now choked the narrow strait leading to the Troad. After 9 years of famine, mutiny, divine sabotage, and agonizing circular navigation that would make a modern GPS unit weep, the Greeks were finally, impossibly, here. The sight of the towering walls of Troy, the mighty fortifications built incredibly by the very hands of Poseidon and Apollo, sent a collective shiver of dread and anticipation through the exhausted men. This was not some minor skirmish. This was the conquest of a city protected not just by stone and bronze, but by the very architecture of the divine world itself. Agamemnon, his face a mask of strained fury and desperation, finally gave the signal, the blast of 100 enormous horns shattering the morning quiet. But the landing, the crucial moment of stepping onto Asian soil, was instantly met by a horrific, cold dread, because the prophets had spoken a terrible truth, a curse hanging over the entire invasion. The oracle had been devastatingly clear. The first Greek warrior to set foot on Trojan land would instantly pay the ferryman. His blood would consecrate the war, ensuring ultimate victory, but guaranteeing his own immediate demise. This was the ultimate price of crossing the threshold, the blood sacrifice demanded by fate to allow the war to proceed. And so, as the massive ships grounded on the beaches of Thymbra, the air filled not with war cries, but with a terrifying silence. Great heroes, Ajax, Diomedes, even the fearless Achilles, hesitated, paralyzed by this chilling mathematical certainty of death. No one wanted to be the first martyr, the glorious, inevitable casualty that kick-started the decade of slaughter. But then, the quick-witted master of deception, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, saw his chance to exploit the terror. Legend says he threw his shield onto the sand, leaping onto it, thus technically touching the ground without his feet making contact, a masterful piece of legalistic subterfuge designed to trick fate itself, or at least give himself plausible deniability. The pause was brief, but it allowed the true tragic figure to emerge, Protestillus of Phylace, a man driven by honor, or perhaps simple, heartbreaking loyalty to the cause. He saw the paralyzing hesitation of the leadership and chose to break the stalemate. He knew the cost, yet he paid it willingly. He did not throw a shield. He did not attempt a trick. He simply leaped from the prow of his ship, spear raised, planting his boots firmly onto the contested sand. In that single breathtaking moment of supreme, fatalistic courage, the war officially began. The sight of their first fallen comrade and the sheer audacity of Hector's instant defense snapped the Achaean paralysis. The ensuing chaos was instantaneous in title. Thousands of men poured onto the beach, screaming the names of their kings, demanding immediate vengeance for the consecrated sacrifice. Achilles, who had been brooding on his ship, watching the macabre drama unfold, now exploded into action, a whirlwind of bronze and divine rage that swept away the first line of Trojan defenders. The landing zone became an abattoir, the initial skirmish a brutal, desperate battle for a foothold. The first order of business was securing the beachhead, a sprawling, chaotic camp established quickly, protected by an impressive ditch and massive earthen ramparts built out of sheer, desperate necessity. This camp, the heart of Achaean power, would be their home, their prison, and their tomb for the next decade. But the Greeks immediately realized the grim truth of their situation. Troy was impregnable. The sheer height of the walls, the tactical brilliance of the defenders, and the enormous supplies stockpiled within meant a quick assault was suicide. The war would not be measured in weeks, but in harvests, possibly for 20 years. Agamemnon, the High King, quickly understood that siege warfare against a city this well protected was a slow, agonizing process destined for failure if pursued directly. The strategy shifted dramatically. They would not hammer the walls daily, but instead they would starve Troy's allies and cripple its vital economic supply lines. For the next 9 years, yes, 9 long, grinding years before the decisive 10th, the war devolved into a brutal campaign of raids, ambushes, and satellite conflicts across the Troad and the surrounding islands. These forgotten years, often glossed over in the main narrative, were critical, defining the characters and hardening the men. The Greeks raided neighboring cities, seeking plunder, supplies, and most importantly, slaves to maintain their colossal army. They needed resources to feed 100,000 men who were constantly hungry, constantly bored, and increasingly disillusioned with the endless conflict far from home. The heroes were not constantly at the gates of Troy. They were scattered, fighting petty kings and terrifying queens in distant territories, expanding the war far beyond the single city. Achilles, the greatest warrior of all, became the most notorious raider, leading lightning-fast attacks that decimated the outlying regions, filling his coffers and building his own legend through sheer, terrifying brutality and speed. He captured Lyrnessus and Pedasus. He destroyed the city of Thebes, ruled by King Achaean, seizing everything of value. It was during these brutal, forgotten campaigns of economic warfare that Achilles acquired his greatest prizes, the spoils that would become the sources of the later, defining feud that would almost destroy the Achaean cause entirely. He took 2 young women captive, 2 spoils of war, 2 living symbols of his terrifying prowess, Briseis and Chryseis. These women, destined to be the catalysts for the war's deepest internal crisis, the moment the Achaeans stopped fighting the Trojans and started fighting themselves, were now quietly waiting in the squalor of the Achaean camp, unwitting time bombs counting down to catastrophe. 9 years of raiding had created unimaginable wealth and unimaginable resentment. The stage was set. The sides were entrenched. The siege was a grinding, miserable reality. And the heroes, having survived the journey and the initial landing, now had to survive each other. The true storm was brewing, not outside the walls of Troy, but deep within the ego and volatile, unstable honor of Achilles himself. 9 years. That is the true, forgotten horror of the Trojan War. 9 years of grinding, bloody silence, where the great walls of Troy refused to even acknowledge the presence of the 1,000 black ships rotting on the sand. The Achaeans, these legendary kings and demigods, were reduced to raiding parties, scavenging farmers, and glorified pirates, tearing through the countryside not for glory, but for grain and slaves. Agamemnon, the king of kings, found himself ruling a restless, starving mob, not a unified army. His greatest fear wasn't Hector's spear, but the mutiny whispered around every flickering campfire, the corrosive boredom that threatened to dissolve the entire alliance into dust and bitterness before a single arrow ever struck the high city. The oath of Tyndarus was a cage, and the Greeks were pacing within it, waiting for the spark that would either release them or consume them. But while the rest of the army rusted, one man refined himself into pure destructive steel, Achilles, the son of the sea nymph. He cut a blazing path through Phrygia, Lesbos, and the surrounding territories, shattering the Trojan alliance structure with terrifying efficiency. The riches he brought back were staggering, a deluge of gold, cattle, and captive women, cementing his status as the indispensable engine of the entire Greek war machine. He was feeding Agamemnon's army, but in doing so, he was also feeding his own monstrous ego, making him untouchable, or so he believed. Among the spoils of the city of Lyrnessus, he sees the beautiful Briseis, a royal woman of gentle birth, who was instantly designated as his personal prize, a physical representation of his supremacy over all other kings, including the High King himself. This was the silent, internal competition for honor, for time, that defined the Achaean command, a contest Achilles was effortlessly winning. Meanwhile, far away on the island of Chrysae, Agamemnon's own men, in a separate, less glorious raid, captured a girl named Chryseis. She was beautiful, yes, but her significance lay not in her face, but in her lineage. She was the daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo, whose favor was known to be deadly and swift. This single act, this greedy seizure of a woman consecrated to the sun god, would become the match that finally, spectacularly, ignited the decade-long Cold War into an inferno. The universe, perpetually seeking balance, was about to teach the Greeks that not all women are prizes, and not all priests are powerless. One sun-drenched afternoon, an old man arrived at the palisades of the Greek camp, walking with the heavy, deliberate dignity of someone who carries the power of the divine. It was Chrysis, wrapped in the sacred robes of Apollo, carrying a staff draped with garlands of pure white wool, symbols of supplication. He brought with him a king's ransom in gold, enough treasure to buy back 10 beautiful women. He did not demand, he pleaded, offering the wealth in exchange for his daughter. All the Greek leaders, moved either by piety or common sense, urged Agamemnon to accept the ransom and respect the priest of a terrible god, warning him of the unseen dangers that lurked behind celestial honor. But Agamemnon, bloated by his 9 years of unchallenged command and recent successful raids, saw only weakness in the old man and a direct challenge to his authority, to his right to claim whatever spoils he pleased. His pride had calcified into tyranny. The King of Kings spoke words that would haunt the entire Achaean world forever, his voice dripping with spite and vulgarity, telling the sacred priest to leave, never return, and threatening to keep the daughter for himself, consigning her to a life of perpetual servitude and indignity. The war that began over one woman, Helen, was now fundamentally changed by the seizure of another, Briseis, turning brother against brother and sealing the doom of the entire expedition. The battle for Troy had not yet begun, but the civil war among the Greeks had just been declared, guaranteeing untold suffering and the potential collapse of the entire siege effort before the Trojans even had to lift a finger.